Most copies of Arendt's book end with this chapter, though we won't. Her first edition contained another chapter on the Hungarian Revolution and what we might learn from it. In later editions, she omitted that chapter and published it as a separate essay, but I'll look at that chapter next. Here, however, is the book's more famous close. And if it seemed to you that Arendt's history is as much social and philosophical commentary and reflection as it is objective description, you're not at all wrong. Clearly, this book is written towards this mid-20th century moment of despair, the ashes of the Holocaust only barely cold. The terrors of the Soviet Union continue, though in subdued form in contrast to Stalin's work, and elsewhere around the world, small dictatorships and fascism flirt with something altogether darker. Mao is not far away in China. Pol Pot as well, Socialist Romania, Burma, now Myanmar, North Korea, Eritrea, others. Arendt knew about none of these when she wrote these chapters. Totally different historical schools of thought approach the classification of totalitarianism from non-totalitarian regimes differently. Some won't agree with the short list of countries I offered, and here, in this closing chapter, Arendt sketches out just what the problem really is. We had never before seen anything like it. Totalitarian thought had no place in our social or academic frameworks, in our conceptions of governance. Once we set aside legal, moral, and utilitarian categories for thinking about it, we ran out of words to describe what we witnessed. Now, we often place our governments on continuums, more or less democratic, more or less transparent, law-governed or lawless, legitimate versus arbitrary power. So Arendt makes little headway herself in placing totalitarianism in the family of Western thought or outside of it. Either choice there should make us uncomfortable. Maybe she was too close to it when she was writing. This is undoubtedly why she makes little effort to hold herself to something looking like academic objectivity. And who could blame her? I mean, at some level, isn't a disciplined academic study of this banal horror itself a sort of ignorance, a refusal to acknowledge the truth of it? Can we really treat its discussion as we would the dissection of a frog or a problem in physics? This isn't to say that Arendt hasn't offered us an academically solid historical analysis. Up to this point, no one had examined the primary documents in such detail. But in order to understand these, to frame them in a way that academic discourse was impotent to reveal, she needed to find a methodology and language that acknowledged the limits of the academic. She cites Plato and Kant for her ways to Western truth and finds both approaches crippling. In brief, we can't use reason to describe what is beyond reason. Arendt argues that totalitarian regimes do not follow laws in the legal sense, but laws in the sense of the movement of nature or the movement of history, of their power and inevitability. On its face, this seems absurd, except that this notion is fostered by our earlier discussions of race thinking and class erasure, Darwin and Marx, and we can understand the approach if we imagine that what drives it is not reason, but ideology. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on ideology. There are plenty of places out there to learn more about this word if you're not super familiar with it. In brief, it is a belief which imagines there is a single idea that can explain everything, and this belief creates its own brand of self-perpetuating logic. For Arendt, whatever ideology you hold, liberalism, environmentalism, nationalism, theocracy, the Christian right, communism, each contains the seeds of totalitarian thinking. Each works to explain what futures we can expect. They cement themselves into our minds and they resist revision even when our personal experience shows us something different. And they create their own methods of demonstrating their truth. Put this way, it's this inflexibility of mind, this offer of a certain answer to our future, is exactly the kind of thinking a totalitarian regime would prey upon. and we all therefore have in us the capacity to accept such promises. But there's one more component which is essential for totalitarian regimes, and that is that we, each of us, find ourselves psychologically isolated from community, that we're lonely. Now, we're not talking about solitude, and we know well that the lonely may live amongst crowds, and often do. Loneliness is a kind of abject despair, and isolation which is felt internally. It is an isolation which threatens the beginning of terror. Now imagine this. Arendt calls loneliness and isolation a kind of pre-totalitarian condition. And then, more prescient than we asked for, writing 70-odd years ago, she says that loneliness is becoming the everyday experience of modern life. Yes. Yes, it is. Even while we become better networked, a funny and revealing sort of word, very utilitarian to rename our relationships. As I said, following Arendt's work has been a number of experiments in totalitarian power, each replete with its own horrors, each built upon unquestioned ideological framing, and each seeking the outright erasure of the human individual on a mass scale. Ultimately, at least so far, they are relatively short-lived phenomenon, dependent as they are upon a single leader, though regimes like North Korea's have successfully passed this along for a few generations. Maybe it's best that we continue to look in the other direction there. And it would seem that this dire warning of Arendt's is a fitting and prophetic way to end this book. But still, she's determined to offer us something, an idea which demonstrates that even in this moment of isolation and despair, there is the possibility for a spontaneous act of freedom. Here's her closing paragraph, a single paragraph, after 480 pages. But there remains also the truth that every end in history necessarily contains a new beginning. This beginning is the promise, the only message which the end can ever produce. Beginning, before it becomes an historical event, is the supreme capacity of man. Politically, it is identical with man's freedom. Initium ut esse homo creatus est, that a beginning be made, man was created, said Augustine. This beginning is guaranteed by each new birth. It is indeed every man. It's a meager hope. What might slow the seemingly inevitable? Only that new people will be born to try again. I think I'll have more to say about this later.